so one of the things that we want to look at is real world exploitation, to see how this actually happens in the real world. And as a part of this, like our organization manages on a daily basis multi-million-dollar ransomware and extortion campaigns where organizations have been breached, and we come in and basically help them uplift their security extremely quickly using Evolve, identify the entry point, contain the breach, and maintain assurance over the environment. So we get to see a lot of these attacks as to how the exploitation actually works in reality. So I want to step through a couple of real-world exploitation examples. So one of the circumstances is a new vulnerability, critical remote code execution vulnerability gets released. And we've seen a number of these get released over the last 12 months or so, one of them being the famous Log4Shell exploit that ruined a lot of people's Christmases recently. There was a whole bunch of critical exchange vulnerabilities that came out, and there's also the Spring4Shell vulnerability that came out. So what happens when those vulnerabilities come out is that threat actors jump on them really, really quickly. Right, so the next thing that happens is the phase for global exploitation, and this happens very, very quickly. So what happens is the exploit gets developed for the vulnerability. So it may be that a vulnerability is announced. The exploit is then developed, and that can either be developed by private cyber criminals, or can also be developed within commercial exploit frameworks. Can also be developed by security researchers or hackers who, not putting them in the same category, security researchers or hackers who develop the exploit and release it, right? And that becomes open in the public. And so what then happens either for private or open exploits is that suddenly you find that there's a big global exploitation scanning that occurs across the internet, searching to exploit that one vulnerability across the entire internet. Right? And we've seen within some of the larger organizations, especially universities, who have multiple Class B networks, for example, so you can actually start seeing trending across, you can actually see the attacks, the exploitation attempts going across the environment as it hits one IP address after the next, after the next, after the next. So you can actually see that occurring. And what happens is that they find something that's exploitable and they break into it to get that initial access into the environment, and that happens globally. So it's not just one organization, it's a whole bunch. So then once they have that initial access, they then move on to the extortion phase of their campaign. And what that involves is moving from that initial access to be doing privilege escalation on the host that they compromise, but also privilege escalation through lateral movement within the environment to take over the environment. They then do data exfiltration and then deploy ransomware to encrypt all of the systems. You then have a ransomware combo, extortion combo, where they hit you from every side to try and get you to pay either the ransom or the extortion. So that's one way that exploitation occurs. When you think about exploitation, you also need to think it's not just software being exploited, it's any attack that's going to breach your organization. Right, so this is another attack vector that we see quite commonly where a third party has suffered a security breach. They've had their passwords stolen. Those passwords have then been shared either privately or publicly again on the dark web or on Telegram or on torrents or whatever it is, or on Pastebin. And also those passwords can also be sold. So again, either on the dark web, or it can also be through things like stealer malware that's infected machines and are collecting credentials and session tokens and all of those sort of things. It then moves on again to that global exploitation phase. And instead of going and trying to find a software vulnerability to exploit across the environment, these attackers are then doing targeted reconnaissance of the organizations that have been leaked within the password dumps. They're searching for administrative services exposed on their systems, as well as their cloud services, which might be your email or your cloud providers, and trying to use those credentials simply to log in. And then again, it goes on to the extortion phase where they're doing privilege escalation, data exfiltration, deploying malware, and extorting you for typically, anywhere between sort of $4 to $10 million in most cases. So those are a couple of examples, and you can see that between those two scenarios, one is a critical vulnerability that's actually exploitable. Another one is an attack vector where passwords have been leaked that can actually be used to exploit your systems or compromise your systems to get access to your environment. What you're not seeing in these real-world exploitation attempts are all of those vulnerabilities that you see in your vulnerability scanners, or 99.9% of them, where you've got minor misconfigurations, or you've got insecure SSL settings, or something along those lines, where they're best practice security to harden those, but they're surely not used for mainstream exploitation of organizations. And that's what we need to focus on to be able to protect your organization with the resources that you've got and the budgets and the technology that you've got, without wasting your time and allowing your team to free up their time to then do strategic activities.